Good afternoon. My name is Farah Guerrero. We are about to start the Blue Hour. This is a comeback show on CiTR 101.9 FM. This program began in 2008 when I had very young children. It was under the name of Prof Talk. And over the years, probably 70 or so guests have appeared on the show, mostly from the University of British Columbia. And the aim of the new name, the Blue Hour, is essentially the same. It's a show about talking with professors about what they know best, and this can include researchers, grad students, and it's really about a conversation. And today I am so lucky to have a great comeback guest. He is I would say, maybe my coolest guest that I might have ever had on my show. Robert Komaniecki is from the School of Music. He's a professor here at UBC, and he has studied music theory at the University of Minnesota and completed his PhD at Indiana University. But his work moves across a lot of genres, so popular music, film music, video game music, hip-hop, music pedagogy, and his dissertation analyzing the parameters of flow in hip hop studies rap delivery through rhythm, rhyme, and vocal pitch. He's also interested in how music theory can move beyond the traditional Western art music canon, and he teaches, among other things, a video game music analysis course for non-music music majors at UBC. So, Robert, thank you so much for coming into the CiTR studio to do my first live comeback show in many, many years.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it's a real pleasure. I decided to dress a little more hipster to talk with you because as I realized you are someone that is quite a cool guy, I would say, in our community, and it's we'll get into that. But before we do, I have to do a land acknowledgement, and this is to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. But I'm thinking today of the Musqueam post at UBC, carved by Musqueam artist Brent Sparrow Jr. He's the son of Susan Point, and the post tells us about the Musqueam origin story. And it's very close to where we are in the CiTR studio, literally just down the street from us, close to the UBC bookstore. And so it feels especially meaningful because we'll be talking a lot about visual language and symbols, and I think that pull will kind of be a good start to the show. But let's start with you, Robert. Who are you, and why do I think you are so cool? I think maybe you might give us a sense that beyond being a professor, you've got quite a few platforms out there. You've got quite a few followers, and I would say likes and on different platforms. And there's a lot of humor in what you do as well, which is really lovely.
Oh, man. Well, I can't speak to whether or not I'm cool, but I'm Robert Komaniecki, and I teach both music theory and music history here at UBC. I have since 2023 as a lecturer, and I've been teaching all sorts of courses here, some on like the history of popular music, some on kind of more niche topics like 20th century classical composition. And this past semester, I was teaching some music theory courses and also a big course on video game music that was being offered to non-majors. So that was a lot of fun. Lots of students from all over the university came in, and we had a really good time. Here in the Vancouver community, I also occasionally get recognized on the street. I have an Instagram account where I make some videos about my experience coming up to Vancouver after living in the United States for the first 33 years of my life.
Yes, and I have seen the video, and it's quite funny, but as is many things, and it's a funny in a good way because what you do, Robert, and this is includes what we're going to talk about a lot today, about a lecture, a keynote lecture that you delivered, if I'm not mistaken, quite recently at McGill University. I was just there very recently myself in Montreal, and it's this ability to bring something that's quite serious, so music theory, and we're going to be talking about something called music notation a lot today, but also bringing it into a world that is very accessible and very interesting, and to see why so many people are finding things like music notation so fun and enjoyable, and it's beyond the sound, and we'll talk a lot about that. But why don't we dive into that lecture, because I have a confession. I would have loved to have been sitting there listening to that lecture. And today on the show, we're not going to play the many pieces and you could argue like beautiful, rich material that Robert had played during that lecture. We're going to talk about it instead. But I got a sense that it was really full, and I can't imagine that you didn't get anyone that didn't enjoy listening to that lecture by it. And I found that it's not only beautifully written, but it really made me engaged from beginning to end. And it is about something quite extraordinary, the idea that musical notation, so this is what we would see in a musical score, how we can see it as a visual object, as something that has an enormous aesthetic value, but how it can even be understood without its sound. So let's start there.
Yeah, that's right. All about the idea of music notation, whatever that might be, serving some sort of artistic purpose, even if there is no sound accompanying it. And so this keynote lecture that I gave at McGill was spanning, I think, kind of the history of this practice from many centuries or even millennia ago up until the modern day, where music notation is often kind of decontextualized and regurgitated as things like memes or in jokes online. And so there was a lot to cover, but my aim was to be as entertaining and as informative as possible.
And there's something that you say, it's about something called iMusic, which is, maybe you could define for us, because I think that's like a really good way to start thinking about this.
Yeah, so iMusic, it refers to this idea of music that is not meant only to be heard, but music that has some sort of special appreciation that goes with the aesthetic or visual component of it. Some early examples of iMusic might be something like a musical score that is written in darker ink to signify, some sort of like death or sort of more morbid topic. Or there's this monograph from, I think it's the 16th century, this by a French composer, where it was it was a love song, and he wrote it and he structured the musical beams in the shape of a heart. And so that's something that if you were playing the music and you weren't looking at the score, nobody would ever know. Nobody would know that you were just, that you had music in the shape of a heart. It's something that you could only appreciate if you were looking at the physical score itself, which I think is really interesting.
So in your lecture, you do exactly that. You bring in the history, but it starts off with actually this idea that an undiscovered a composer, an American composer by the name of Heinrich, if I'm not mistaken,
That's right.
very well known, he arguably one of the most important of his time, but then was rediscovered, not necessarily through what we would think a classical composer would be discovered by in terms of his music, but was discovered by this idea of the iMusic, so the visual notation on his musical score became so popular. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So Anthony Philip Heinrich was this composer, this American composer. Some people think he's the first full-time professional American composer. And he was not particularly successful. Um, didn't really achieve wide notoriety and wasn't performed much beyond his death. And then on this fateful day in 2022, a Twitter account named Threatening Music Notation shared a small excerpt from one of his pieces. And all of a sudden, millions of people were looking at the music of Heinrich. And it wasn't because of the way his music sounds, it was because of the way his music looks. Um, there's a piece by him that features the smallest notated note value in any Western music composition, which is a 2048th note. So if anybody out there is listening, you might remember things like quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes. But if you keep on having the values of that, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on, until you get to a 2048th note. That is a very, very short note. It's absurdly short. And the reason that it was getting so much attention is that people who knew how to read Western music were looking at this and saying, this is absurd. This note would be like 3 milliseconds long. What was he thinking, composing something this bizarre? And it brought a lot of attention back to his music, and kind of shows how just, without even hearing it, just looking at such a kind of frankly intimidating or threatening musical score can start a lot of conversation.
And threatening is one word. There's menacing as well in that
Yeah.
lecture. So it is very interesting that that Twitter account, which was started, I believe, in 2000. I had it in my notes. 2021, 21. So 5 years ago, right? Had gained within about a year or two over 300,000 followers, and it was really became a community forum as well, where musicians started to share all kinds of things beyond even these sort of extraordinary notations that no one would ever expect to see. Why don't you tell us about that, but still stay with us a little bit about this idea that the visual notation itself was so striking to people that it, as this Twitter account continued and more people started to share, you started to put these pieces together to say, wow, music even with no music that's being heard on social media, which is often a platform, right, of audio in many respects. It's just these notations. And you've also said that even sometimes a thumbnail that could be on YouTube that might just have a musical notation, so people that may not even have the ability to read classical Western music are still drawn to it.
Yeah, the McGill lecture ended with a big reveal, which was that I was the one who started threatening music notation, and it was the Twitter account, and it was this funny moment where all the students in the lecture hall kind of like smacked their forehead, like, "Oh, of course," but yeah, I was the one who started it, and my reasoning for starting it originally, besides maybe pandemic boredom, was also that I was interested in how people were responding to these decontextualized musical fragments. And I was especially interested in why they were sharing these things, why they were sharing just pictures of sheet music with no attached audio. That was very interesting to me, because I had always thought of a musical score as this sort of a technical document, a set of instructions that you need to follow, and the music, the actual thing of value, is the sounds that comes out of that. And then all of a sudden I was seeing this large community forming around just the written instructions. And people were sharing it for all sorts of different reasons. I think people love to share, for example, there was this piece that was shared. It was sort of a joke piece, Music for Celestial Trumpets by Tom Johnson. And it's just a few notes that are just absurdly high above the treble clef, so high it's many, 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 many ledger lines higher than any instrument in the orchestra could ever play. And it results in the score looking like a receipt from the grocery store. It's like this really, really tall, long thing. And people were sharing it, and I think the reason they were sharing it is partially because they wanted to show that they understood the absurdity of it. That it was kind of this demonstration of their technical proficiency in Western music notation. They could be like, look, everybody, I know enough about this that I understand that this is interesting. I understand that this is funny or absurd. I'm in on this joke. And so, yeah, I was watching this community of musicians form around this and kind of noticing the different things that they were drawn to. And I wasn't really quite sure what to do, but it was really fun to sort of sit back and moderate the page and just watch and see which direction it went in.
I hesitated to say that you were the
Yeah.
the founder of that account because the surprise was wonderful to me too when I read your lecture. But of course, and I love how you sort of sneak it in a way that was quite a surprise even to someone that just read it. But there was a couple accounts, Twitter accounts, that were trying to sort of do the opposite of what you were doing. So taking the non-threatening music on, what was the name of the one? It was
Oh, well, there was a
was
few
there was
sort
a
of
few
a few
right
spoof accounts.
spoof
There
accounts
was,
exactly.
yeah, there was non-threatening music notation, which would post, like images of, like, kids music lessons, little music notes that have smiley faces in them and things like that. And then there was the other account, threatening music notation, which primarily just responded to my posts with threats against me, which I thought was pretty funny. There was, there was confusing music notation. There was reassuring music notation. It really kind of spawned like a whole little mini universe of accounts that were kind of running with similar ideas.
It's fascinating, and I was trying to think a lot about this music notation as something, because I'm someone who's studied a lot of languages. And Musqueam, I will say, that was one of the ones I studied at UBC when it was first offered here at the University of British Columbia. Beautiful language to learn. I can't help but thinking about musical notation, because I'm not a musician, as a sort of language. And it made me wonder whether or not the appeal online for people wanting to see musical notation in some way, even if they, for those that can't even read it and they click on the thumbnail just because of how it looks, made me think, is it also an interesting time in our lives where the visual is always part of the written as well? Because if you look at social media, even short videos are now kind of laden with words. In many cases, it's almost like subtitles sometimes, and it could be because this way people can watch their reels without having to have headphones, and they can still engage. And I wonder if musical notation is part of that.
I think that's a good observation. Yeah, it seems like in order to maximize the spread of something, you need to, kind of universalize the mediums that it can be interpreted in. And so if somebody can't like audibly hear something, then being able to like visually see it, that's helpful. And I think that music does have some things in common with languages, in how people react to it. I think that people that are, members of, people that speak certain languages, I think sometimes they enjoy the process of, finding communities that share that language and signaling that they speak that language, much in the same way that musicians will sort of openly signal, like, hey, this is something that I can do. I've spent time to learn how to do this, and me being able to do this is my membership card into this little community. So I think there's definitely some overlap there, even though, typically we don't say music is a language. Some people say music is the universal language, but a lot of music scholars kind of take issue with that just because of music's kind of differing uses across cultures.
Yeah, and we are, for the most part, talking about the Western musical
Mhm.
notation. So just that clarification is important. But let's move it a little bit to this idea of the aesthetics, the beauty of how someone so I have attempted to learn music, and the first was last year. The first instrument that I decided to learn, if you can believe, was the cello. And
Oh, wow.
little did I know that that was a difficult instrument if for a first instrument with someone with no musical background. But the bass clef, okay, when I actually started to get the, left hand going, I actually was really drawn, and this is coming from a very naive, like no musical background at all, to the way the bass clef looked. It was so beautiful, and it reminded me of learning a language like studying Arabic, also here at UBC, because of its sort of, the symbols that felt very flowy. It felt in some ways, when I started to learn the musical notations on the scores, it felt very much like calligraphy. And so you do talk about that, but you also bring it into a historical context, which is really interesting because in your lecture you talk about how over the centuries musical scores would be painted, right? So you could look at maybe 15th, 16th century Italian paintings where you have these images of musical books or scores that are being held sometimes by the individual person. They might be placed on a piano, or they might even be in a sort of form of a choir where you've got people painted, gathering, looking at it. But what was fascinating when I was reading your lecture was that in sometimes that the notations, it's either not discernible or it's not even what, you could even make out as music. And however, it plays a really important part in the painting, and for us believing that this is of importance to be painted.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about the bass clef as being this kind of like a beautiful thing, because I agree. Um, and yeah, that was a good clarification about us being talking about Western music notation. It's what a lot of people here in Canada would think of when they think of music notation, which are these dots with stems and the 5 lines and, little flags connecting them and things like that. And I agree. I think that these symbols are really quite beautiful. I love how they have so little in common with the alphabet that we're working with on a day-to-day basis, but they are so internally consistent. It's this really nice logical system. There's also repetition within it. Most music is repetitive, and that's what people are drawn to, is repetition in music, that familiarity, and that's reflected in the repetitive motifs in music notation as well. And so there are it's understandable that people are drawn to it, but I also think that over time we have learned to associate Western music notation with beauty, with sophistication, with maybe a sort of, erudite artistic sensibility. And when I think when people in the 15th and 16th century put music notation in their paintings, they were doing it for a few different reasons. But one of them was that they were trying to convey sophistication. It was understood that if somebody was of this kind of educated class, that they would have more time to learn something like music. And so if the painter could accurately convey music notation in their work, then that shows that the painter themselves was educated. And some painters even managed to sneak in their own compositions into their paintings, which I think is really cool. But ultimately, over the centuries, it became this sort of shorthand for you see Western music notation, and you know that that's associated with sound, and you know that that is associated maybe with this kind of like upper class, refined artistic sensibility. Something that I might push back a little bit on nowadays, but at the time it was a artistically logical thing to do.
And we haven't talked about other ways that music notation became an object of something quite visually beautiful. So we can definitively say now that you'll find musical notations on wallpaper,
Mm-hmm.
or people will have tattoos. my cellist teacher, I remember she had tattoos that are embedded in her on her skin, right, where these notations could appear. So I think there is so much to be said about what we started off the conversation with how music in its written form in this Western context, especially, is seen as something familiar, but also has entered our lives in a really intimate way.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that interests me so much is that Western music notation has become such a such a symbol of music itself in our culture that it will be used to represent music that was actually never written using Western music notation. So the example that I give in my lecture is from a children's book about rappers. And almost no rap music is written using conventional Western music notation. It's usually a mixture of a digital audio workstation and maybe typed or written up lyrics, but not eighth notes, treble clefs, bass clefs for the most part. And yet, in this child's book, in order to show that there's music playing, there are little floating Western musical notes everywhere, as if that is the only way to visually show that there is music happening. So it's like such a strong symbol that we don't have we often don't have anything better than it to show that music is happening in this kind of visual sense. Same thing goes for almost any music that you hear on the radio now. It's almost always not going to be composed using Western music notation, at least not as the primary form of transmission. It's a more eclectic mix of digital mediums and other things nowadays.
Now, for those of you who can read this stuff, which I know you do well, because you're also a musical theorist, right? You teach musical theory. When you see something that could be represented in that is supposed to be a certain song, but maybe it's not, like it could be a painting or an
Mm-hmm.
image, are you drawn to that kind
Always.
of, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and musicians love pointing this out where, for example, one thing that always makes the rounds in my email inbox is this are like birthday cards. And often on a birthday card, they might try to, write out some sheet music and then have the lyrics for the happy birthday song. But the sheet music will have nothing to do with the actual notes of the birthday song, just because whoever was designing it thought, okay, I want the association with music to be there, but they maybe didn't understand that the actual birthday song is going to look a certain way on a musical staff. Another example is there's this Italian restaurant that had a fancy looking menu. I think it was the restaurant was called like the Wolfgang or something like that. So maybe they were going for the association with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But at any rate, they had some sheet music kind of as wallpaper on the menu, just to add this little extra veneer of sophistication, which works really well until you look more closely and you realize the sheet music is the theme song for the Flintstones. And it was probably something that, whoever designed their menu just kind of looked up and slapped on there and didn't realize that it had actual musical connotations beyond just sophistication.
And now something a little deeper. These are questions that I am fascinated by because I don't have musical notations in my head when I hear a song. I have what a lot of people have when a song becomes part of a kind of internal memory and you can hear a song without seeing it or hearing it, like it's just in
Mm-hmm.
your head. I had met a Roman singer at the Rome airport once, and I didn't realize how famous she was until we parted our ways, and I started to listen to her music, and then I decided to write her a letter, and I said, how do we hear, when you wake up at 4 a.m. and you hear music without actually hearing it. It's something that's quite fascinating to me. But I wondered, when you're trained to read music, and this is just a really basic question, but do you, like, when you're looking at a score silently, are you internally hearing the sound? And, is there kind of an inner auditory sort of imagination that comes about with that? And that might explain, too, all of those followers that are sharing this, because in some ways a lot of them are musicians, and so it does, there's more something happening that I feel is almost more internal.
Yeah, I think most trained musicians will, I mean, it definitely varies from person to person, and even very highly trained musicians might not hear, have an internal hearing of a piece of music after looking at it. Part of what I teach is how to, is encouraging students to form those habits of looking at music and then trying to audiate it or hear it before they ever actually play it, just because that helps with things like rehearsing and performing. Um, Speaking for myself, when I look at a piece of sheet music, I generally have a vague and somewhat accurate representation of the music going in my head. There will usually be big gaps, like if I look at an orchestral score, for example, and my eyes are just kind of scanning over it. An orchestral score is going to have many different instruments. And so I'm not going to be simultaneously I'm not going to be able to internalize, the violin melody and the woodwind's counter melody and the viola harmony and the cello and the double bass and the percussion. But my attention might kind of bounce around. And so I'll notice like, oh, the violins have this staccato melody happening here. And then it looks like the double basses take over with an answer here. And I'm kind of, it's the way that you could walk around a room in the dark and sort of approximate your surroundings, even if you don't have an exact representation of them.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to talk about your musical notation, especially in relation to this lecture? There was the ending is really fascinating to me, and you got to put that lecture online because I think people would love to read it. Yeah. You do say that the borders of music are more porous than any other art. What do you think exists beyond those borders, and why do you say that?
I consider music to be porous because every time I think I have a clear and concise definition of music, something comes along that challenges that. There have been things that I would say that I hear and I'm like, that is doubtlessly music. And then the person making them says, not to me. And so then we're kind of in this disagreement where the person that's originating these sounds is like, I don't think of this as music. And then to me, I do. And we can't ever necessarily reconcile those differences because of the subjectivity of art. But I also, my wife is also a music theorist, and she has done a lot of work on deaf musicians. And so often the first questions that people will ask her are like, well, how can deaf people ever make music? And it turns out that they can make music in a lot of different ways. Not all of those ways involve audible sound at all. There are deaf musicians out there that will do an entire performance just with gesture. And that will be music to them. And if I had the opinion that that's not music, that doesn't undo their understanding of it as music. My wife also talked to somebody who was deaf and blind, and when he was sitting with some friends in a jacuzzi, and the bubbles turned off, somebody said, go turn the music back on. And so like to them, that tactile sensation of bubbles was the music. And so, to me, that doesn't make any sense. But to them, it makes perfect sense. And neither of us is more right than the other. It just kind of shows how broad that category of music can be.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful. But you also say something also at the end, which really struck me and as a writer, that you sort of challenge the notion that if music notation can be seen almost as something beyond the music and the sound, could we read a book of prose about, let's say a sculpture made of marble, maybe somewhere in Rome, or, could we see, in quotations, a dance piece just by ear, by listening to the music. And so I think there's something quite deep in what you said at the end, and maybe you could.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time about thinking about that way that we can just look at music notation, and sometimes we don't lose anything. Sometimes we do, just by looking at it and not hearing it. But sometimes we even gain something. And I've not been able to think as much about how that kind of medium transference might relate to something like sculpture. What would it look like if we were to just listen to a lecture about sculpture, not ever seeing it, not being in the same room as it? What would it look like if we were to, um, I don't know, look at a painting that's a representation of a book? That would, surely something would be lost there, but maybe something to be gained as well. Yeah, I think that being willing to push an artistic, to push an art out of its intended medium sometimes can bring us into really interesting places.
And then there's this idea, which I didn't say, and it was a term I hadn't heard of, but been coined by psychologists. Was it the attention economy?
Yeah,
And so in this world where something like a musical notation, even if it's just a small part of a larger score, can get so many likes and so many,
yeah.
some gauge so much interest online. That is a testament to some of the challenges that you say at the end of your lecture. Can we even look at art and feel art or see and imagine art in ways that wouldn't normally be the way they're intended to be?
Yeah. I think for a lot of my peers, the idea of little snippets of music being decontextualized and then just kind of shared, maybe as an internet meme or something, that's an upsetting one. They don't like that idea. And initially, to me, it was a little bit uncomfortable as well. And the idea of an attention economy is this idea that our attention is a valuable commodity that can be purchased, that companies are vying for, that we can give willingly, but our attention can also be stolen, and that it's something that's very worthwhile. And when it comes to the ability of when music notation can capture some of that attention, and so I was just kind of asking myself, can we use that knowledge and do something good with it? Are there things that we can do for the better of everybody, knowing that music notation can capture our attention in that way? The things that I chose to do were things like using people's attention and directing it towards, fundraisers for musicians in need. We fundraised enough money to purchase a whole professional oboe for a kid down in Arizona. We partially helped fund tuition for an aspiring violin builder, luthier, in Chicago. People that weren't going to be able to afford this musical path, and then, because of this threatening music notation account, they were. And I think that's really cool. That doesn't undo my discomfort with seeing music snipped up and decontextualized. But it just is another piece of the story for me.
And what's interesting, it's kind of somewhat there is a discord. There's something that doesn't feel right, but yet at the same time, when you've got an academy, of music, of people that want to protect what they feel is very sacred and very important, the tradition of even just the evolution of Western music, for example, might feel at odds with the new influencers on YouTube that have lots of, millions of people, where, they could be even, there's some that will even make musical scores for things that no one would ever imagine, musical music to be in that form. And so it becomes now accessible to people. So but at the same time, they're working still in that sort of same pathway of music. So it is interesting because in some ways it feels, of course, I'm sure there's a lot of absurdity that's maybe beyond,
Yeah.
the seriousness. However, there's there is still a happy medium. And you mentioned this one YouTuber that in your lecture that has his TikTok channel, which is a little more in the absurdist sort of, but at the same time, he's got a YouTube channel, and he, his background, even though he's anonymous, he's quite a serious musician as well, percussion, I believe. And so, but he does both. And both are good for him because he's getting, but at the same time, I think you quoted the idea that even if someone stumbles upon one of the cat videos where, music is cat videos are very popular, they will potentially also stumble on some of the more serious stuff too that he's bringing out. So compositions that no one would have ever had an opportunity to have the scores in their hands like that. So
this is a score follower, and he's this composer and sort of content creator, and he will take normal moments or funny moments and he'll transcribe them into Western music notation. And then show the music notation underneath the video. And sometimes the results are really funny because it'll be this video of, I don't know, like a cat meowing sweetly, and then it'll be transcribed in this exacting musical notation. So it looks like the cat is not just meowing, the cat is actually performing some like precisely notated piece. And so that draws people in. People are amused by that, but then they might end up kind of going into his pipeline and finding some music that's composed by really interesting or even avant-garde new composers and checking it out because of his willingness to meet them where they are, which I think is great.
Let's now talk quickly about this class that you mentioned at the beginning that you just taught. I'm really curious about it. And when was it taught? You said you had students from all faculties, and this is about video game, like understanding music. That like, and can you be really specific? What type of video games did you do? Sort of the whole spectrum, or
it was the analysis of video games, video game music course. And it was our first time ever offering it at UBC, and we opened it up for 50 students outside of the Faculty of Arts, and it filled up just instantaneously. Lots and lots of interest, which was a delight. And these students came in from all these different backgrounds, and some of them had no musical background at all. Some of them had decades of musical training. Some of them had extensive tech training, and some of them did not. And so everybody had these different areas, these different strengths, and it was kind of a fun challenge to draw out these different strengths in different people. I wanted the class to be a bit of a survey that starts in like the earliest bleeps and bloops of video game music. Back when video games were, contained in these massive arcade cabinets, and the speakers might be this really primitive sort of oscillator that can only make one sound at a time. And then moving all the way towards the modern day where video game music is no longer constrained necessarily by what the hardware can do. If you want to record an orchestra for your video game, you can, as long as you have access to an orchestra. That wasn't the case for something like the Nintendo Game Boy, which only had 4 channels, 3 of which could play notes, and the 4th which is white noise. And so composers used to have to get very creative. Not to say that they aren't anymore, but they had strict limitations on what their machines could do. And in some cases, the more complex your music got, the less complex the game had to get because memory was such a limited resource on these early machines. And so teaching this class, it was like kind of this trip through history, but we also did gameplay samples and responses. In the classroom, I would set up game consoles and we would play and talk about the different sorts of effects and tricks that the composers used. We had a student composer come in and demo some of the music that he had written for a project. We had multiple students that were part of the game dev club show off their games that they had made in class, which was just like so special. I loved kind of just relinquishing the floor and letting them talk about what they had been doing. And I really, it was maybe the most fun I've ever had teaching a course because of that diversity of backgrounds. And every day I felt like I was learning as much or more than they were, because some student would come in and tell me something about the process of building a game that I had never considered before, because I was too busy learning about string quartets and treble clefs and bass clefs during grad school. And so yeah, it was a really, really great time being able to teach that course.
And so you had students, when you say from all faculties, I
Mm-hmm.
can imagine like mechanical engineering?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and plenty of people from computer science as well. And so they were my go-to people to help me build out my explanations if ever I was struggling with something relating to the coding issues or whatever. But yeah, I mean, we covered everything from like the physical properties of sound to the recording process for the Guitar Hero games. It was a really, really big class. It was a lot of fun.
I remember once driving on the Sea to Sky Highway and listening to the radio, and it was about the complexity of the video games that I grew up listening to in the 80s and 90s, you
Yeah.
know, even something like Super Mario Brothers. And it was a real epiphany to me that these composers, this one Japanese composer, was like, it was so intricate and it was so complex and so difficult. And it was really cool for me to hear that what you appreciate as a child is just a very familiar sound that you play over and over again is actually very complex.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, with something like the Super Nintendo, with the Super Mario Brothers franchise, that machine only had the ability to generate a couple voices simultaneously. And so if the composer wanted to give the impression that there was a lot going on, like a big ensemble playing, they would need to have one voice do many different things, jumping around, playing a melody, but also booping down and doing this like lower arpeggio part. Or if the composer wanted to give the impression of a trumpet being played, they couldn't just sample a trumpet. That wasn't something the machine could do. Instead, they had to think, how can I make this little robotic sounding square wave sound like a trumpet? How can I write for it in such a way that it makes people think of trumpet music, even if it literally sounds nothing like a trumpet? And those challenges were like so interesting and fun to talk about with the students.
So arguably one of like a really enjoyable class, it
Yes.
sounds like.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
how did you propose that? I'm just curious about the backstory.
You know,
Or was it already taught and
it,
then you brought it?
no, I was the first one to teach it. Initially, uh, I was sort of voluntold to teach a video game course to music majors at UBC. And so I've taught a video game course to the graduate and upper level undergrad musicians for a couple years. And that's always been really great. We end with this big final project where they can take it in all sorts of different directions. And I had somebody make a video game that's played with a recorder, like that you see in elementary school music classes. It was so much fun. But then there was enough sort of interest, and there was this opportunity to teach it to non-majors. And I said, yeah, let's give it a shot. And I'm really hopeful that eventually I can teach it again. Because it was just like this runaway success, much more so than I ever anticipated it would be.
If you have joined us, and it has been a pleasure, 50 minutes has flown by with Dr. Robert Komaniecki here from the UBC School of Music, and this is exactly what I was expecting. You've got so much to offer here to UBC, and you are relatively new, right? A few years in Canada.
That's right.
And here to stay, we hope.
We hope.
Yeah.
Yes, hope against hope.
Yeah. And you can reach out to him in many ways. You can contact him at the School of Music. You've been listening to the Blue Hour. This is a relaunch show after a few years of hiatus, but it's been on the airwaves on CiTR 101.9 FM, originally called Prof Talk. And the idea is simple. Today, I wanted it to be a really relaxed conversation, more intimate, and I feel we achieved that. I hope you feel the same, Robert.
Absolutely.
this is a type of guest that I could go on and on about, but time is up, and we will hopefully have you back or follow you if you can go to your what's the best way for anyone that wants to get onto some of your.
Oh, well, you could always just Google me. That'll take you to most of like my faculty page and
Google.
my Instagram.
Just Google.
I'm all over the place. I'm the big guy with colorful shirts and a beard that comes up when you Google Robert Komaniecki. So it shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah, there was one thing I wanted to say I really enjoyed. It was a video on YouTube. You got these really short videos and polymeters. Am I saying that right?
Oh yes,
yeah,
polymeter.
Right? Polymeter. Yeah. So it's a polymeter video where you're explaining what a polymeter is, according to, I can't remember the title, but about like a separation divorce.
A professor going through a nasty divorce. Yes, yeah, that's a fun one for sure.
And this is Robert. He's got all this stuff online, but it's very smart. You show what a polymeter is, and did you write the words?
Yes.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was never an actual divorce. It was only ever as a joke. Very happily married still.
That is good. That's good. But it might, it could mean something to someone else.
Yeah.
But very funny. I know a little bit about polymeters based on the music choices of my sons, and they're complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I think divorces can be messy and complex
so,
too.
yes.
So that's what I got from that. But so I think we'll end today. We are going to be on the air every Tuesday this spring and hopefully all summer, Tuesday at 2 p.m. on CiTR 101.9 FM, and also live streaming on CiTR.ca. We've got a wonderful lineup ahead, some more musicians coming from your faculty, from your School of Music, as well as some from other great professors here at UBC. And my goal is live interviews. I love it. It's fun, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed today's show. And thank you very much for your time in coming out to the studio today. And we look forward to just following up with you and seeing where the next adventure leads you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Okay. And finally, the show will be podcasted, so on CiTR.ca. And as well, I'm hoping on a blog. So the show is called The Blue Hour, but the blog is thehourisblue.com. And I'm hoping to put, with your permission, Robert, a partial transcript of this interview. So some of the best parts on the blog as well. And that will also have a link to the podcast, which, if I can get my sons to help me on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, we can get them out there too. All right. Thanks very much. And best wishes.
Yeah, to you as well.
Enjoy the spring and summer.